a lot of people have got this arbitrary figure of about 2 billion people in their minds. I think the thing that is so difficult right now is to even imagine that amount of people living in the infrastructure that we build around us, because all the infrastructure, starting from cities and transport and services, and the way that our economy works, the way that our society function, is all geared up towards either stable or actually raising, like increasing population. Most of the Western countries rely on the youth to be paying for the pensions and for the health systems for the elderly. So the idea that we can just undo the last 75 years of progress and somehow slip back into, the mid 1950s, for example, and live happily ever after doesn't strike me like a seamless transition that is just going to be joyful for everyone and good for everyone, because it seems like if we were making that transition, we are going to be taking the steps back in some of the progress that we've made, because I'm not even sure whether we can sustain the type of life that we have with that little people.
Well,
What's
I
your opinion
consider
on that?
this. Well, there's a whole movement that's associated with this, the degrowth movement, and it's kind of an ideological perspective. It's not. I mean, they claim that it's science based and all the rest of it, but I don't see a lot of science in it. I see a lot of almost like religion in it. like people thinking that there's some magic associated with a smaller population, and I don't know that there is. I mean, the arguments are that, for example, that we don't have enough resources to sustain the human population. Well, the evidence is right now that we're actually doing a pretty good job of sustaining the human population. I mean, for example, we're supposed to, if you read Paul Ehrlich's book back in 1968, you and I should be on this call deciding who's going to get the last crust of bread where we live. I mean, because we were going to overpopulate the world, and we weren't be able to feed people. The famines that exist in the world today are mostly political. They're things that are a product of decisions that human beings are making about stability in their countries and the ability to distribute the huge amount of food that we make in this world. So it's not about that. It's not. I mean, if you look at the evidence, every aspect of what has happened to human beings over the space of the last 50 years has all moved in the right direction. I mean, longevity. I mean, I'm sitting in Canada talking to you today. The average person in Canada back in the 1920s lived to the age of 57. They now live to the age of 82. And that's progress. In China, they were living into their mid 30s. Now they live to a similar age, into their late 70s. They more than doubled human longevity in a very short period of time, just back to the 1960s. So everything from that you want to take a look at, from longevity rates through to infant mortality, through to declining levels of violence, through to access to food, access to education, human literacy. All of these things have improved over the space of the last while as the human population has got to 8 billion. But the good news for the people on the degrowth side is that we're never going to get to 9 billion, and that we're going to peak mid-century, and then we're going to start to decline. So they may be actually right about what's actually going to happen, but it's not because we see any great benefit in creating their 2 billion society. We're just going to end up there just because of the collective decisions we're making, the individual decisions, that we're making that add up to the structure that's going to create this decline.
When you said that we will peak at just under sort of or around 9 billion sort of mid-century and then start to decline, I believe that there is a little bit of disagreement with regards to the figures that we will achieve, and that's certainly one of the international bodies that predicts these type of things. You don't necessarily agree with their findings. So can you just talk us through that figure that you've kind of arrived at, and what are some sort of other
sure.
differences of opinion?
Well, when we were writing the book back, a few years ago, the consensus was that the UN's figures of 11.2 billion, maybe a little too high, but probably somewhere between 10 and 11. Now I think there is a growing consensus among demographers that even the 10.4 number that the UN has put out is probably too high. And the reason for that is because fertility is collapsing far faster than anybody thought it was going to. COVID has had a really strong effect on people's willingness to have children. So they really delayed things, and now, our health crisis has become an economic crisis in which people believe that the cost of living has become too extreme. So they're cutting back on the possibility of having families, particularly larger families. So as a result of that, things have collapsed far faster than anybody was predicting. So, the UN still has every year has China higher than actually the Chinese government has. Their figures, and we can debate about whether or not China has an incentive to say that their figures are higher than and they may actually be lower than what the Chinese are actually telling us. India is now below replacement rate. They're at 2 and probably going to decline from there. So that's 36% of the global population.
Mm.
Each of them are 1.4 billion people. I mean, where are the other places that are going to replace it? Well, Africa, you say. Well, Africa's, first of all, is not big enough. And they have a stubborn problem in terms of longevity. Even though they produce a lot more children than other parts of the world, even their fertility is declining, but also their longevity isn't as much. So Nigeria, expected longevity is about 55 years of age, like Canada was back in the 1920s. And so they have to put in place their healthcare infrastructure. They have to put in place a more stable political infrastructure. And if they want to take economic advantage of the population that they have and the population growth that they have to put in place the economic infrastructure to be able to create manufacturing like they created in a place like China. So there's a lot of issues that are related to Africa actually being able to replace what other parts of the world aren't having. So when I look at all of these figures, it's just like, I don't know how you get to 10 billion,
Mm-hmm.
because unless the Chinese and the Indians are doing it, and they're not, and they're declining, there's nobody else big enough to fill in the gap. And the other models that I've seen that have come out, and there's a really good one that was published in the Lancet that was put out by the University of Washington. Most of that work, those estimates were put out prior to the pandemic. And even their estimates were probably closer to about 9 billion. Well, that's still a billion point two lower than what the UN, or billion point four lower than what the UN had, which is the size of the Chinese or the Indian population. And this was prior to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So you sit back and you say, are we going to get to 10.2 billion people or 10.4 billion people? Very unlikely. So somewhere between 8 and 9 billion is probably where we're going to get, and then peak, and then by the end of the century, probably something between 9. The total population will probably drop down to where it is today or lower. That's the truth.